Good afternoon. We are excited to present Bridging the Divide, RTO and the Future of Public Service. My name is Dhriti Mehta, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Amrita Chavan, Kevin Hua, Aidan Tomalty, and Sahiba Khera of the Return to Office, RTO, Implementation Committee at Employment and Social Development Canada, ESDC. Next slide, please. ESDC stands out amongst federal departments, not just because of the scale of its operations, but because of its people. With nearly 40,000 employees delivering essential services like employment insurance and the Canada Pension Plan, ESDC's workforce plays a direct role in shaping Canadians' everyday lives. What makes this workforce unique is its composition. 60% of employees are under the age of 30, significantly younger than the federal age of 43.5. This distinction matters when considering workplace policies like RTO, as the expectations and work habits of a younger workforce may differ from those of an older demographic. Looking beyond ESDC, we find RTO is part of a broader shift in both the public and private sectors. While the federal government is reducing office space and adjusting its workforce under the RGS2 framework, we see contrasting global trends. Countries like the US and Australia are enforcing a full return, while the UK and major consulting firms like Deloitte and PwC continue to embrace hybrid models. ESDC now finds itself at a crossroads, trying to align with these trends while maintaining operational effectiveness and employee satisfaction. Next slide, please. The current RTO policy at ESDC stems from a broader Treasury Board directive implemented in mid-2024. However, its rollout has been anything but smooth. Employees across the department feel the directive is disconnected from operational realities, particularly in roles where in-person work does not enhance productivity. In rural communities, engagement and training advisors worry that mandatory office attendance adds unnecessary burdens without tangible benefits. Beyond the policy itself, its uneven implementation has only added to frustration. Compliance with ESDC's hybrid work model is already low, with less than 60% of employees following the existing guidelines. Stricter RTO measures have deepened tensions among younger employees and public service unions who expected a more collaborative approach. Employees feel unheard and tensions with unions continue to rise. This frustration has spilled over onto social media and public protests, drawing negative attention to ESDC's handling of workplace policy. In response, TBS has proposed a stricter 4-day RTO mandate and potential restrictions on employees' online discussions about work. But the debate over RTO is about more than just logistics. It reflects a fundamental disconnect between what employees and senior management envision for the future of work in the public service. Next slide, please. At its core, the challenge with RTO is not just about where employees work, it's about how the public service is evolving and what that means for those within it. On one side, there's a push for structure and in-person collaboration. On the other, there's a growing demand for flexibility and digital-first engagement. These competing visions of the public service have led to a disconnect between ESDC senior management and employees. As we navigate these competing priorities, the question remains, will RTO create a stronger public service or push it further apart? Ultimately, this isn't just about returning to the office, it's about what kind of public service model best serves Canadians. To explore this further, I'll now pass it over to my colleague, Aidan Tomalty. Next slide, please.
The disconnect my colleague mentions stems from two competing visions of the public service. There is an established vision and an emerging vision. In the established vision, management expects public servants to follow a set way of doing things. They believe that public servants should work in office and behind the scenes to deliver programs and services to Canadians. On the other hand, in the emerging vision, employees believe that we are in a digital era. As a result, public servants expect remote and hybrid work and the flexibility that they offer. Along with this, these public servants believe that there is space online to talk about their work and how they should go about program delivery. But despite these differences, both visions agree that the job is about serving Canadians. Next slide, please. We all share a common goal, And at the heart of our commitment to Canadians is the values and ethics code for the public service. It is our guiding North Star. Respect for democracy, stewardship, respect for people, excellence, and integrity form the basis of the public service. They guide our work at all levels and set expectations for how the employer and employee will treat each other. RTO is a short-term challenge that has not been able to break the shared commitment to these principles. Senior management and public servants are still on the same team using the same rulebook. Public service values and ethics should shape how we approach RTO policy to balance our operational needs with evolving expectations. Next slide, please. We have identified 3 options to implement a 4-day RTO. Our first option is the full implementation of RTO, where senior management at ESDC would enforce the TBS directive immediately and without any changes. Our second option is a regional RTO implementation where ESDC would mandate a 4-day RTO for public servants whose work is done in the regions, but employees whose offices are in the National Capital Region, or NCR, will continue with hybrid and remote work. Our third option is a targeted RTO implementation where ESDC offers public servants hybrid and remote arrangements based on the type of work they are doing, while also tackling the issue of limited office space for those returning to in-person work. I will now let my colleague Kevin Hua walk us through our analysis and evaluation of each option. Next slide, please.
Option 1, the full implementation of RTO, involves ESDC applying the 2 recommendations of the proposed TBS directive, a 4-day RTO mandate and harsh restrictions on social media use for all public servants in the department. This option will, as one of its positive characteristics, improve public trust and faith in the government by returning public servants to the office so they may visibly work and serve Canadians. Additionally, the monitoring of government devices for unauthorized personal social media use will help to enforce integrity and ethical practices within the public service. A full implementation of the TBS directive, however, also comes with significant downsides, chief among them being the severe restrictions on public servant social media expression. It is likely that a policy of such broad scope and limitation will be legally challenged as violating the freedom of expression of public servants under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, creating a high legal risk as seen in the chart below. Furthermore, it will likely have a chilling effect on the free expression of public servants in the long term and risks giving a negative appearance to the public of the government muzzling public servants. On top of that, returning all ESDC public servants to the office for 4 days will dramatically worsen an already precarious office crowding situation. Under the current 3-day RTO mandate, 65% of public servants have had to share workspaces in order to work, a figure that will likely rise higher under a 4-day RTO mandate as public servants return more often to the office. Next slide, please. Option 2, regional implementation of RTO, would see ESDC advise TBS against the directive's recommendation on social media use and only apply the RTO recommendation to public servants working in the regions and not in the NCR. The logic of this option being, communities are calling for regional public servants, like the employment and training advisors, to return to in-person work to improve service delivery and client engagement. This would be a more tailored approach that satisfies these concerns and demands by sending regional public servants back to the office without upsetting NCR employees who do not believe they are needed in office. The fundamental problem with this option, however, is that the regions and their public servants may view this as an unfair and double standard application of RTO that favors the NCR, deepening regional inequity and animosity. Furthermore, I'd like to highlight from the negative consequences in the box on the right that the regions will likely struggle from higher employee turnover, as 50% of equity-seeking public servants have said they would consider exiting the public service over RTO. This would significantly hamper talent and skill retention and our ability to meet EDI targets in the regional public service. Next slide, please. Option 3, a targeted implementation of RTO, has ESDC requesting an exemption to the TBS directive. The department would, subsequently, implement its own RTO strategy based on anchoring principles to ensure in-office presence is based on need. ESDC would also enter into partnerships with municipal and provincial counterparts to develop office sharing for regional public servants. The underlying strength of this option is that it recognizes that employee satisfaction and productivity decline when work arrangements are unilaterally mandated, regardless if it's in office or remote. They improve when employees are involved in determining their work arrangements. This is also reflected in employee retention, where including employees in deciding their work arrangements has the effect of increasing retention by threefold compared to those who are unilaterally mandated back. This option, however, is not without its potential consequences. As this option will move in contrary to the directive, it is possible that the department may encounter pushback from TBS, creating challenges in the feasibility of the option's implementation. On top of that, the option imposes a hefty administrative burden, asking ESDC to determine, assign, and apply various different RTO arrangements to the thousands of public servants in the department. Next slide, please. The risk assessment chart compares and contrasts the risk analyses for each option. Looking to the second column, it is clear that option 3, the targeted RTO implementation, has a particular advantage over other options when it comes to mitigating the risk of stakeholder pushback. This is because option 3 takes a more collaborative and partnered approach with public servants on RTO, demonstrating a willingness to listen and be receptive to their concerns and the values and ethics of the public service. In turn, it satisfies the unions, reducing their encouragement of RTO resistance and decreases friction with public servants. While there is an urge among management to return to the way things were before, the reality is our world and indeed the public service has changed. Our approach should seek to achieve what is most effective for Canadians, public servants, and the government. It is in everyone's interest for public servants to be satisfied, as happy public servants are productive public servants. Based on the risk assessment, option 3, a targeted RTO implementation, is the preferred option to move forward on RTO. I'd now like to invite my colleague, Amrita Chavan, to explain the implementation and communication strategy. Next slide, please.
Targeted RTO focuses on 3 key implementation tasks: anchoring principles, infrastructure reallocation, and engagement and dialogue. The timeline includes an immediate term with a deadline of March 1st, 2025, short term with a deadline of June 1st, 2025, and medium term, which will end March 31st, 2026. The first task is developing anchoring principles for work arrangements. This will be led by an ESDC TBS interdepartmental working group. They will ask ESDC employees to submit working patterns, schedules of where and when an employee works to their managers. The working group will also assess community needs. In the short term, the ESDC TBS working group will analyze the data to determine where in-office presence is needed and which positions can be adapted to different work arrangements. These decisions will be based on job profile, on work patterns, and community needs. In the medium term, the ESDC TBS working group will map out and implement anchoring principles for work arrangements that are fair, efficient, and choice-based. The next task, infrastructure reallocation, will be led by an ESDC and Public Services and Procurement Canada, PSPC, interdepartmental working group. This group will use the work arrangements data and assess the availability and suitability of office space across Canada. In the short term, the ESDC PSPC working group will collaborate with stakeholders like municipalities and provinces to establish co-working spaces and shared tenancy agreements. In the medium term, office space arrangements will be implemented. Finally, to foster unity and shared values, ESDC will carry out the engagement and dialogue implementation task. ESDC will immediately prepare communications materials addressing stakeholder concerns. In the short term, ESDC will launch the communications campaign and begin developing new channels to increase dialogue and open communication between employees and management. These new channels could include surveys, feedback portals, employee town halls, and symposiums. In the medium term, ESDC will launch these channels. It will also host training programs and outreach events to promote shared public service values, to promote strong working relationships, for team building and a healthy work environment. With these three implementation tasks, ESDC takes a partnered and pragmatic approach to RTO. Next slide, please. We have developed a multi-channel communications plan for ESDC's 4 audiences: TBS, public servants, external stakeholders such as provinces, municipalities, and unions, and finally the Canadian public. This plan addresses concerns and reduces areas of friction. To TBS, ESDC senior officials will advocate for an RTO exemption, emphasizing that a presence with purpose RTO is more efficient and aligns with public service values. For public servants, ESDC will stress that it is listening to their concerns and that workplace modernization will be inclusive and fair. To external stakeholders, ESDC will affirm its commitment to working with them on a modern and proactive RTO solution that balances both employee and community needs. Finally, to Canadians relying on ESDC services, ESDC will emphasize that serving communities has always been at the heart of their work. Despite post-pandemic work adjustments, ESDC will always prioritize consistent, quality service delivery to communities. Next slide, please. In closing, it is clear that 2 competing conceptions of public service have caused a disconnect between employers and employees at ESDC. This has manifested through pushback over RTO. The work that ESDC public servants do is vital to improving quality of life for millions of Canadians, and so it is equally vital that ESDC navigates RTO collaboratively and pragmatically. Policy option 3, that is targeted RTO, takes a proactive and partnered approach. It modernizes workplace arrangements and fosters efficiency and unity on shared public service values. This is how ESDC can ensure that its workforce is resilient, adaptable, and ready to serve Canadians effectively. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful that our boss today is at Carleton, so I'm sure you all know who he is. It's obvious you guys put a lot of effort into this, and I want to thank you so much. You know, you get a week to put this together, and it's really quite impressive that you can do it in a week. Given that you've given us more time than other teams, I'm going to take the, in an authoritarian way, I'll take the first question. One of the things I'm not sure, I was looking at your appendices. With respect to the choice you've made, how do you know it worked? What are you going to go to, like, how are you going to go to Treasury Board and say, we've got an exemption, thank you for the exemption? Like, how are you going to measure that it worked? And how do you put that up against the costs related to it? Because I looked for the costs and I didn't see those either. But the question is really, how do you know if you succeed?
I can take that question. Thank you. So our metric for determining success comes through looking at compliance levels and performance. With compliance currently below 60% at ESDC, immediate enforcement without engagement risks further resistance. So our recommendation focuses on increasing buy-in through clear communication, predictable scheduling, and demonstrating workplace benefits, as we believe happy workers are productive workers. That is where we want to focus it. We expect compliance to improve over 12 to 18 months as employees adjust to structured hybrid work policies. And the way we would want to look at structured transition would be a clear benchmark to mitigate concerns. So we could propose quarterly progress reports to ensure alignment with broader public service goals. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. The first person on our panel I'm going to reach out to, or we'll ask a question. Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you very much, committee. That was a really engaging and informative presentation. I thank you for that. Now, you've said in your presentation that though there is a disconnect between management wanting workers back in the office and generally public servants wanting more flexibility, you feel that there is solid connection in the values espoused in the Public Service Code of Ethics. And so looking at your implementation schedule, I think it was on slide 12, and let me just give you a preamble from the directive. It says that public servants are prohibited from commenting on any issues that the government has taken a public position on, regardless of whether that occurs in their office hours, work hours, or their personal time. So looking at your implementation, the directive says that consultations with the unions should happen prior to any rollout. You've got sort of an immediate, medium-term rollout. Where will that consultation with the unions take place, if it will, and how will you address this dual work comment versus personal time comment? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Beg your pardon, I can answer that. If we go to slide 12 of the implementation roadmap, when it comes to consultations with unions, that would take place when the development of the anchoring principles is occurring, that's led by ESTC and TBS, where employees submit in the immediate term, they submit working patterns to managers. And at the start of the short term, where data analysis, which is determining where in-office presence is needed, and it will take place between those two terms because unions will have a say in contractual obligations when it comes to workplace arrangements. And employees will be, as they submit their working patterns to managers, and managers are working with TBS to determine where in-office presence is needed, they will have to consult with unions as well on solutions that are proactive and inclusive. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
And just very briefly, thank you. It does. And the dual work comments versus comments in their personal time. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I if I could add to my colleague about that. If we can go to slide 18. The core issue we have with this part of the directive that's proposed by TBS is that it likely infringes too far into the freedom of expression of public servants. As we look under case law, particularly the case of Osborne v. Canada, it was determined that any restrictions on the freedom of expression of public servants in line with the duty of loyalty must be done as minimally as possible. And so we view it as perhaps too broad in restricting speech in their personal time, or even when public servants aren't identifying themselves. There are circumstances under the current case law and current standards that we have that do allow public servants to express themselves. And we view the current recommendation as not nuanced enough in order to thread those needles. And I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Suzanne. The other person on my panel I'm going to pass it to is Guy Jarno.
Thank you very much. An excellent presentation. I just had a question about I'm going to speak of return to work actually, and how your options differ from the Treasury Board directive, because as I understand the Treasury Board directive, the proposed one is actually flexible. It does call for return to work 4 days a week starting June 1. But it says that starting March 1, there's to be a review of all positions. Departments have to submit a work plan, which indicate which positions are required to be in the office or virtual or subject to hybrid. So my question is, by positing, option 1, very strict implementation, and then, options 2 and 3 are modified, including 3, which looks at covering positions. Are you sort of exaggerating the strictness of the directive with your option 1 when it in itself has flexible and case by case analysis built into it?
Yes, thank you for the question. The way we view it is, particularly one of the things is the directive implements the 4-day directive or 4-day RTO mandate immediately, which will very likely increase the dissatisfaction and even the public protests we've been seeing with public servants. And so we believe a core part of option three in the targeted approach is that we need to demonstrate to public servants a level of good faith, even just to demonstrate that we are here to actually listen. We are here to actually consider their needs, their perspectives on how they want to work. And so there is a level of similarity, but we do view it as distinct and integral to the public service. And so that's, I think, around where we would differentiate. And I don't believe we're necessarily interpreting it too strictly in terms of how how the TPS directive is proposed. And it is very likely that public servants will interpret it, at least in this light as well. And so it's important to give consideration to these different perspectives. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. I'll give back the rest of the time, Noah.
Thanks so much, Michael. What are your another panel member, Michael?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks very much for this presentation. It was really interesting to listen to and very well presented. I want to go to your anchoring principles. I guess I have two questions around that. Number one is, why do you call it that? It's a really interesting title to give to employees submitting their work plans to their worker, how they basically pattern their work, an analysis that's sort of done of it. But I found the language anchoring principles to be interesting. So perhaps you can explain that. And then second of all, can you explain to me how it would work? You've actually got an implementation roadmap that provides some detail, but I have to say, maybe I'm just being thick, but I'm having trouble absorbing that as I go through it.
Yes, thank you for the question. So to start, we decided on calling it anchoring principles and focusing on that because we want to focus on the characteristics of the individual work that employees are doing. So if we just quickly want to go back to our slide 7, our policy options. We see here with option 2 that the implementation of RTO is along the regional and urban or regional NCR divide. And we found that that might, that it would likely cause more tension between and more inequality, at least in the perceptions of the implementation between the regions and the NCR. So instead, we wanted to develop a more fair and balanced approach to deciding who will return back to work, which is why we follow these anchoring principles to look at the exact nature of their work. So for example, if there is an employee who is doing behind the scenes work, this could be, say, someone who's doing IT or whatever the case may be. If they're not directly interfacing with the public, then we find that there's less of a need to have them in office. But on the other side, what we see with the employment and the employment advisors in the region is that because they're interfacing with the public, and in this case with the municipalities, and we also find too that because the effectiveness of their work is based on being in person with the public and with these municipalities, that it's more important that they're in office, that they do need to be face to face. And so the anchoring principle there is around the exact nature of their work. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Conscious of time, rather than pass it over, I'll ask you a quick question. Obviously, there's an earthquake happening in the United States, and Trump is Trump and causing all sorts of issues. Do you think the fact that that has intervened in the last month is going to change the nature of this return to work of government employees in Canada?
Thank you for the question. We do believe that it has a significant effect in terms of the perception that the public may have in terms of how the government treats public servants. As I had addressed in the presentation, for example, with the social media recommendation, there is a high chance that the public views it as the government muzzling public servants, as we saw during the Harper era. And this can have a serious damaging effect for the public trust and faith in the government. But that's amplified further by what's happening in the United States. That sort of concern of we've seen the Trump administration reaching into the civil service and meddling in it. And so we do believe that is a significant consideration to make here.
And thank you so much for your comments and your advice to the committee. We will take all of that into consideration.